Stay with us here on World Insight on CGTN. Still to come on the program, Brett Kavanaugh has been sworn in the U.S. Supreme Court. Will this controversial appointment shape the midterm election? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The U.S. Senate confirmed the Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court after a narrow 50-48 vote. Kavanaugh has now been sworn in as an associate justice. He could join the court as early as Tuesday. Despite weeks of tension over Kavanaugh's nomination, including several sexual assault allegations lodged against him, the Democrats didn't get enough votes to stop his nomination. President Donald Trump from the U.S. tweeted to congratulate his victory. Some analysts believe this event may cause the U.S. political balance to shift and will have a profound impact over the upcoming midterm election. Whether that is true or not, we are joined in Beijing by Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. In Washington, D.C., we have Bruce Fein, a lawyer and former Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Reagan. And also in Washington, D.C., Steve Pruitt, managing partner at Watts Partners. He's also a former staff director of the Committee on the Budget of U.S. House of Representatives. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Your immediate reaction, Mr. Fein, since you're closer to that job than most of us, about this confirmation, briefly.
Well, I think the confirmation has turned the midterms into a referendum on President Trump. You know, his sneering attitude and criticism of Dr. Christine Ford, who had made one of the sexual assault allegations, just reinforced his perception of a vulgar misogynist. And I think it will have an impact on the November elections, and I don't think it'll be favorable to Mr. Trump. With regard to the future of the United States Supreme Court, I think it's unfortunate that you had such what you would call a great innovation, the narrowness of a vote, which is the first time in 140 years that a nominee has been confirmed by such a narrow margin. It will tend to make the United States Supreme Court appear more as a political institution that is an impartial arbiter. I think that's damaging to the confidence of the American people in the administration of justice. Well, and I also think that there will not be a huge, dramatic wrench in the way the Supreme Court rules. Anthony Kennedy was already conservative. There are a handful of cases, I think they're important, on executive power, where it's clear that Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice, will rule in favor of the executive branch. But those will be, episodic rather than systemic.
Mr. Pruitt, what about your judgment? Will the Supreme Court still function well, or will it become extremely conservative, as many suspect in the U.S.?
No, I think they will continue to function well, and I believe, like Bruce, that the system and the structure of the court will survive even this. Our Constitution and our institutions, I believe, are strong enough to do that. What concerns me most about the court is not the immediate impact of the Kavanaugh appointment, but the potential that will arise 20 years from now if there are additional justices appointed by President Trump that further moves the court in that direction. That will have an impact over my grandchildren and many others.
Well, Mr. Tangen, Mr. Pruitt is already thinking about 20 years from now, but given the lens that the Supreme Court judges serve, it is a rather, reasonable concern. Mr. Tangen, from your perspective, you served also regionally as a lawyer in the United States. How do you see that, particularly how will different parts of the United States read that message and eventually translate into different judgments?
Well, there are a number of factors. If you're talking about this purely from political, what does Donald Trump do over this next month? I mean, he is really...
Before we talk about Donald Trump, maybe let's talk about the Supreme Court first, the 9, as they say, and the impact of the 9 to the rest of the country.
Well, the impact of the 9 to the rest of the country is rather smaller, except when you get into issues like Roe versus Wade, the right to choose for women. And this is really what...
Well, for women, that's a big issue.
That's a huge issue, and the Kavanaugh hearing put that on center stage. Now, this is something that has enraged a lot of people. Everyone has seen all the demonstrations that were on the Hill. They were pounding on the doors of the Supreme Court. This reminds me of the times of suffragettes wanting the right to vote. They are enraged. The question is, how does this affect the country as a whole? We're completely in division. Will this court bring it back together, or will it enhance those divisions,
right,
like Bruce and Steve said?
Of course, having said that, though, gentlemen, it is important to talk about whether this nomination and eventually Kavanaugh coming into the Supreme Court will be a significant political event regarding the upcoming midterm election. Earlier, Mr. Pruitt, your colleague, Mr. Fain, already suggesting it's going to be a referendum on Trump, but that is nothing new. I mean, a month ago, it was already a referendum on Trump, and the Democrats want to see it that way, too. So, Mr. Pruitt, what do you make of the impact of this on the upcoming midterm election, positive or negative, on the current administration and the Republicans?
Well, I would concede to at least one point that my Republican friends are making, which is that this election's probably going to be closer and that there will not be an overwhelming blue wave that's going to spring across the country. That said, though, I think that, in my view, it's clear that the House of Representatives is going to change control, and the question there will be by how many seats, and I have long held that it will be in the 40 to 50 range. I don't see the Senate itself changing in terms of numerical control, but I do see the mix changes. I think there are a couple of Democrats who will probably lose, unfortunately, but I also see a couple of Republican Senate seats that are also going to change. So we're still going to be pretty much at 51-49 with Republican control in the Senate. That said, the larger picture, though, presents in both houses a much more conservative-leaning government in America, and that's going to play itself out in some interesting ways, particularly as you measure conservatism against what President Trump is trying to achieve on a number of issues, and they don't mix well. So I think we're going to see some confrontations there.
Interesting. Mr. Fain, of course, midterm election, many have told me that in the United States it's about getting the so-called the middle out and get them to vote and eventually make sure that one party will have the triumph over the other party. Is that still true with this big political, apparently, event going on with Kavanaugh coming into the Supreme Court? Mr. Fain.
Well, you've obviously got to awaken your constituency with some kind of excitement and belief that things can change. I do think that the Democrats can argue that if they take control of the House, they could open impeachment proceedings against Mr. Kavanaugh for statements that seem to be equivocal repeatedly under oath during the Senate confirmation hearings before the Judiciary Committee. In fact, the person who would be chairman of the committee, Jerry Nadler, has already raised that issue. And again, in terms of the precedent here and the bitterness in which this particular battle was fought, to my mind, it's very portentous. You could have a situation where if the Democrats get control, they could try to expand the number of justices. And if they have a Democratic president, make the number of justices a political plaything and go up from 9 to 15, which was what President Roosevelt tried to do in the 1930s. So that's one of the reverberations that we're looking at to upset our constitutional system. It was St. Paul who said, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." And if you try to push radical changes on slender majorities, you're waiting for a backlash. And in fact, we already witnessed this with regard to the actual confirmation vote. It wasn't long ago when you needed 60 votes, not simple 50, in order to get a confirmation because of the filibuster rule. Well, the Democrats thought that was blocking too many of Obama nominees, so they slashed it to 50 for all but Supreme Court justices. And then Mitch McConnell comes in and says, well, if you can do it for all other judges, we're going to do it for Gorsuch. So they lowered the 60, which ensured against kind of radical change, to 50, and that's where we are now. That's one of the reasons we're confronting a divided country.
But that is exactly what we're talking about here, isn't it, Mr. Puig, that politics has now taken the most important role, even when it comes to the selection of judges on the Supreme Court, and which is being considered as one of the most important parts of the American government. And as you said, it's going to have a long impact, probably 20 years or even further, Mr. Puig. That is the thing.
Well, and I would again reiterate that point, but I would also say that the discussion we're having today is today's news, and I can guarantee you by probably the next 24 to 72 hours, we're going to be talking about something else. I mean, this administration has shown an inability to stay on message and to continue to drive certain points home, and they will continue to do that. Secondly, I think it's important to note that politically, it's probably not a wise idea for the Democrats to be talking about impeachment of anybody. Quite frankly, those of us who do lean Democratic want a whole lot of things done that government should already be doing, and wasting time, if you will, on impeachment exercises really will take the attention off the ball here, because Congress itself has shown they're not very good at multitasking. So I caution every Democrat that I talk to, whether they be in leadership or sitting on the back bench, to get focused on what you're going to do for people and worry about the politics of the court and impeachment some other time.
Whether in the next 48 to 72 hours people will still talk about it is one thing, but the impact of it will certainly be felt for a long time to come. Mr. Tangen, having said that, though, let me ask you also, the fact that we see one battle after another partisan going on in Washington, the question is, will these issues eventually have an impact largely when it comes to content on the midterm election? These issues that the common people really concerned about and they would vote on, Mr. Tangen.
Well, it's actually split. I mean, Donald Trump will be parading around that he's kept his promises, that the economy is going great, and that he deserves all the credit for that. The Democrats on their side will be, of course, saying, look, you know, he's politicized the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
He is not very presidential, and they will be pushing that. But one thing that we should all be aware of, this next election is very, very important for one particular reason. These state legislatures will be doing the reapportionment, and that means that they will be deciding the districts that are going to be making up these congressional districts. And having that power, if they're Democrats, could help them out a tremendous deal. Last time it was Republicans and most across the board, and they were very able to gerrymander what they wanted, and that's part of what has led to this kind of partisan divide. Remember, Donald Trump did not get the popular vote, but he was able to manage it.
Having said that, though, another detail we have to mention, Mr. Puig, to you, that is, during the hearing, Mr. Kavanaugh, the way he carried himself, probably got more concerned than what exactly have been the accusations against him. And therefore, a sacred part of the government, such as the Supreme Court, at least long concerned in that way by many others around the world, now become quite an interesting body which is combining so many different kinds of personalities. What would that mean for the, in a way, the trust people have about the Supreme Court, if we're not talking about politics anymore?
Well, they are going to either earn or lose their trust based upon the decisions that they make. It's interesting, Bruce and I were having a similar discussion about the hearing before this segment, and I think both of us agree that we would have preferred that Justice just admit that when he was young he did crazy things like all the rest of us did, but that he's a grown man now. There's plenty to be said for youthful exuberance, but that he's a grown man now and he sees things differently. That said, I think it's important to note that, again, the decisions they will make as soon as this session of the Supreme Court will kind of lay the true foundation of how they will be perceived going forward. And the good news, I guess, is the Supreme Court doesn't really at least take that many cases that are publicly decided and covered in the media. There are a number that get decided throughout the process. But I think hopefully this term there won't be that many big public cases decided. Maybe Bruce has a better sense of that. But if that's the case, then I think the foundation will be laid.
Mr. Fain, I have to go to you with the introduction by your colleague, Mr. Puig. So what about the credibility of the Supreme Court now, particularly when it comes to the qualities of the individual judges?
Well, of course, it's put under a cloud. I think there were literally scores of occasions where Judge Kavanaugh was equivocating. It was obvious to anybody who was watching to see the body language, the tone of voice, or otherwise. And justice requires the appearance of justice, and certainly Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, is going to detract from that image. Now, with regard to other elements here, because he's on the bench, I'm a litigant, and I will now, if I have a conservative cause, I will create the case that goes to the Supreme Court because I'm more confident with a fifth vote in my favor. So even if the docket now, which was created when Justice Kennedy was on the bench, looks rather innocuous, I can guarantee you it's going to change with regard to the activists who look to the court as some place where they can litigate their public policy preferences and will generate litigation. I can't resist, however, adding a point about impeachment. We tried that, and the Democrats did in 2006. Nancy Pelosi said to all the world, and Mr. President George Bush and Dick Cheney, impeachment's off the table. Then we got presidential wars, we got presidential engagements instead of treaties, we got presidents playing judge, jury, prosecutor to kill American citizens without any due process. We got surveillance on the entire American people. So if you take impeachment off the table, even if it's politically advantageous at that time, it's the ruination of the rule of law.
Well, fascinating discussion, I have to say, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing with us your insights and your observations. Einar Tangen, Bruce Fain, Steve Pruitt, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.